Keir Starmer is not that stupid to make such a hash of things, is he?
Yes, even though he's a KC, he's not stupid with respect. I wouldn't dream of being controversial. As I've always said, Miles, I don't mind being controversial as long as I'm right.
What's going on with the Labour Party? Splitting and all sorts of things going on. Most people who voted Labour didn't expect to get this. Another Tony Blair?
Well, I'm not surprised at all. The key player is Sue Gray. She's effectively acting as the Prime Minister's controller.
And who's she?
Nominally, she is the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. In practice, she's acting as his intelligence controller. Now, that implies, of course, I can't confirm this on film. I should explain, by the way, to listeners and viewers that I haven't had advance notice of the questions. This is not like an ABC presidential debate where the Democratic candidate is usually given advance notice of the questions and the Republican candidate isn't. Sue Gray is nominally a civil servant. In practice, she probably is working with Sierra, the top German agent in Britain, and probably has access to Sir Keir Starmer's Czech intelligence file. Now, this is the key to understanding the Labour government. There are reports in the intelligence community that Sir Keir Starmer was recruited as a young student in 1986, or possibly before, by the Czech intelligence service, the STB, who worked very closely with the KGB in the Cold War. Now, an extract from his intelligence file was released by the Daily Mail during the general election campaign. It's been confirmed that he visited Prague, or Czechoslovakia, as it then was in 1986. The document that the Daily Mail published has been confirmed as authentic. It appears to have come from either the Hungarians or the Slovakians. The Slovakians are very annoyed over the attempted assassination of their Prime Minister, Robert Fico, back in May, and may have retaliated by releasing a document from Starmer's file. But either way, it's been confirmed that Starmer has a Czech intelligence file. What the Daily Mail printed was an extract, a one-page extract, which was a copy of a visa application. Starmer was invited to participate in a sort of volunteering project rebuilding a memorial to the victims of the Lidice massacre back in the World War II, when the Germans massacred villages in Czechoslovakia, Lidice, in retaliation for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, which is what the Germans called their part of Czechoslovakia. Not the whole of Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Germans. There was a little puppet state over in Slovakia. What they call the provinces of Bohemia and Moravia were administered by Reinhard Heydrich. Now, I've met someone who knew Heydrich. He was quite a charming man, very good piano player, anti-Semitic, of course, and quite vicious. So you could be charming and vicious at the same time, quite ruthless. It is possible to be charming and ruthless at the same time.
And very polite.
And very, yeah, he was very polite, yes. He wouldn't shoot you without apologising first. He'd still shoot you, but he'd apologise. Now, Heydrich was a rival to Wilhelm Canaris, who then, after the war, headed up the DVD. Canaris actually set up the assassination because he was controlling the head of MI6, Stuart Minges. So MI6 staged the assassination of Heydrich, but at the request of Admiral Canaris. It was all to do with internal manoeuvres within German intelligence. It was nothing to do with the Allies trying to win the war. It was an intra-German battle. Well, I don't think people are going to lose faith in politics. They are going to lose faith in the Labour Party, and so they should, because the Labour Party is effectively a collection of house-trained idiots implementing...
Very dangerous house-trained idiots.
Well, yes, they're implementing policy that's been dictated to them by the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. And Sue Gray, of course, came out of the Cabinet Office, did that dodgy report on Partygate. My prediction is that Starmer will be gone by the spring. I think Sue Gray will probably be gone by Christmas. I think Starmer will be gone by the spring. I suspect there'll be more revelations over his security file. Now, I was party to conversations with Moscow via a back channel recently, and I understand that President Putin is considering releasing the Russian copy of his file or extracts from it, which would pile pressure on him. And of course, at the moment, he's under pressure from Zelensky, who also has a copy of the file, to allow Britain to allow the Ukraine to use British-supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles against Russian targets inside Russia proper, which would be absolute madness.
Well, we seem to be living in a mad world.
Well, it is a fairly mad world. That's because the Germans largely run it. Anything the Germans run is going to end up being mad. Well, I wouldn't say that we were at the brink. I was involved in very quiet discussions to try and calm the situation down. And one method of calming the situation down would be for Moscow to release further extracts from Starmer's STB file. Now, I should explain to viewers, the STB was the Czech service. They were trained in gay honey traps in particular, but also in heterosexual honey traps. They worked very closely with the KGB, and if the STB were targeting a Western individual, then they would do so in close collaboration with the KGB. And it was quite common in the Cold War for potential leaders, like Sir Keir Starmer, they would be talent spotted at university and would be recruited. It was a German technique, but bear in mind, the Czech was set up by the Germans, the Bolshevik Revolution was bankrolled by the Germans, the Warsaw Pact intelligence services were essentially followed German training and methods because they were set up by the Germans. And in 1986, they were controlled by someone I actually met, my old friend, General Oberst Marcus Wolf, who was an enemy, but quite a charming enemy. Much more charming than Heydrich, although not as good a piano player. I did the interrogation on Marcus Wolf over the recruitment of Ted Heath. Classic example, Ted Heath was recruited at Balliol College, Oxford, in 1937 by the Abwehr.
And a nasty piece of work.
Ted Heath was a very nasty piece of work indeed. He was very grumpy. We never got on. Marcus Wolf, for example, was far more charming than Ted. I like Marcus. I mean, again, there's no point people writing in and saying, Michael, he was the enemy. MI6 tried that line on me years ago. Marcus was coming to England. I was tasked with interrogating him. There were two MI6 officers present.
What do you mean coming to England?
Oh, he was. This was long after the Cold War had ended. This was 20 odd years ago, and he was going to address a meeting of spooks in the Reform Club. Michael rolled up with a couple of chaps from MI6, and I did the gentle interrogation afterwards. But it wasn't. There were no thumbscrews. I just bought him a decent scotch. He was very partial to Chivas Regal, as indeed am I, and we had a quiet little chat about the recruitment of Edward Heath.
So no thumbscrews.
No, oh God, no. I leave thumbscrews to Thames Valley Police and the Gestapo. But
the Tories, I mean, it's a party that's been around a very long time, and likewise Labour. Do you think that at the beginning of the 24 years into the 21st century, do they still, either of them, have a future, and do the Liberals have a future?
I think the Tory party has a limited future. It wasn't wiped out in the election. The polls were wrong. They predicted a wipeout. It wasn't a wipeout. But the Tory party, I don't think the Tory party will ever govern in its own right again. That's because I don't think after the betrayal of its voters in 2019 over immigration particularly, but also Brexit, after a betrayal of that scale, I don't think the Tories would ever be trusted again in the north of England. And I anticipate that the so-called red wall seats will be won by Reform, and that we'll have a Reform-Tory coalition, possibly as soon as next year, because I think Labour will split.
Is it splitting already?
It's starting to split already.
I mean,
yes.
I'm just talking about headlines in the local newspapers and their party conference.
But yes, we've got the party conference going underway in Liverpool at the moment. And there's already a split. The unions are very unhappy with the government, The Labour Party is now seeing rebellions of up to 50 MPs if you can count abstainers as well as people voting against. They're applying they're whipping fairly heavily, and that's limiting the number of MPs voting against. But there's obvious unhappiness over the attack on pensioners, for example, which was dictated to Rachel Reeves by the Treasury, and she clearly had agreed it with the Treasury months in advance of the election.
Is that because, from a demographic point of view, pensioners are Tories?
Yes, I think there's a feeling that the Treasury are pro-German. The Treasury have strangled the British economy for over a century by its absurd, mad theory that the way to increase tax revenue is to increase taxes, which is nonsense. If you want to increase tax revenue, you grow the economy. To grow the economy, you cut taxes. It's called the Laffer curve. Now, the Treasury forced Britain to increase taxes after World War I, and it took us decades to pay off World War I, whereas the Americans cut taxes and paid off World War I by the middle of the 1930s. That's because they had a Chancellor, a Treasury Secretary who understood economics. Now, the Treasury, well, the Treasury are very anti-growth. The Treasury dictating policy to Labour, and the Treasury are very unhappy about pensioners voting for Brexit and for the Tories in 2019. So in a sense, it's probably payback time for Brexit. But there's also a view that pensioners tend to vote Tory, and the Treasury and the Cabinet Office are keen to hammer the Tory party. So pensioners are being targeted deliberately, and Labour have gone along with it, which is crazy. I used to be in the Labour Party. I mean, the decent deal for pensioners was one of the things that we stood for, at least nominally.
Well, I think since Tony Blair, the Labour Party's never been Labour.
Correct. It's certainly you couldn't call the present government a socialist government. It's not on the side of working people.
So what about the Liberals?
The Liberals don't understand.
They've won a seat in my constituency.
Yeah, but they only won 72 seats because people wanted to give the Tory party a good kicking. And that's because the Tory party hadn't implemented the policies on which it won the 2019 general election, which were sensible Conservative policies. There was nothing particularly wrong with the Tory party 2019 manifesto. The problem was they decided not to implement it.
Well, Liz Truss seemed to have won the popular vote in terms of the party.
Oh, Liz Truss
was sabotaged and coup d'etat with Rishi.
She was removed in a coup, yeah, exactly. A coup backed by the Cabinet Office and the Bank of England. Obviously backed by the Germans, deep behind the Bank of England and the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. You've got the Germans, and they wanted Liz Truss out. They were very alarmed by her policies, particularly on tax, which were quite rational, by the way.
But was she just simply too naive to realise what she's up against?
Correct. I mean, the theory was that I was going to go into a government as Lord Chancellor, and I'd cut a deal with MI6 prior to Liz Truss being kissing hands. And the intent was that I would be in her government as Lord Chancellor, but also playing a role as intelligence advisor. So any coups that were going along could be spotted. But somebody made sure the message never reached her. And I did try and follow up the discussions with MI6 with a direct approach through the front door, just in case the backdoor message was, the back channel message was blocked, as indeed it was. But none of the people I dealt with got the message across to her. But there was also a fundamental difference between us over Ukraine. So it probably wouldn't have worked anyway because of Ukraine. She would have to have backed down a little bit on Ukraine. I don't think they would. And of course, declarations of war have gone out of fashion. The last state to declare war was Chad a few years ago in a war with its war with Sudan. But it's certainly a very dangerous escalation, and I am strongly against it. We know that Zelensky was seeking to blackmail the British government, again partly with the contents of Starmer's STB file, which the Ukrainian SBU got when the KGB broke up. Because bear in mind, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and Ukrainian intelligence came out of the KGB, and the files went across to the SBU. So the SBU have the old KGB file on Starmer. Now, I understand that Zelensky was using that in an effort to blackmail Starmer. Of course, what Zelensky had overlooked, which was unusual because he was himself a CIA asset, although he was bankrolled by the CIA and effectively installed by the CIA with the German Career Group, which is part of the DVD, sitting behind them, he'd overlooked the fact that CIA had also got the file from SBU. So CIA had the file on Starmer. That meant it was a Mexican standoff.
In what way?
Well, both the CIA, that meant the administration had the file, and the administration are not very happy about long-range Storm Shadow missiles being used against Russia.
What's the capability of a Storm?
Well, it's a very accurate cruise missile. It's not as long-range as the Tomahawk. In fact, I was once involved in a plan to re-engine the Tomahawk. The Tomahawk is a long-range cruise missile.
What's long range? 1,000 miles?
Over 1,000. Tomahawk will go over 1,000 miles. The Storm Shadow is about 200 miles. It's a much shorter range missile, but it's got a much better chance. But that means it'd have to be launched from within Russia.
Yeah,
but it's got a much better chance of hitting the target than a Tomahawk, and it's got much better ability of penetrating defences.
In other words, not being seen by radar.
Not being seen by radar. It's a very good little missile, Storm Shadow. It's not new. It's been around for a while, but the RAF swear by them. And there's certainly it's not the sort of missile we want Ukraine firing off against Russia inside Russia.
That would be fired by jets, or do they have drones big enough to hold those things?
You can fire it. Well, they've probably modified it for ground launch. The Storm Shadow was an RAF bit of kit, and it was designed to be hung under the wings of the old Panavia Tornado, the swing wing aircraft. So it's small enough to be fitted onto a pylon under the wings of a supersonic fighter jet.
How far could those missiles be realistically fired?
Not going to hit. They're going to fire.
What could they hit?
Well, fired from the Ukraine, they wouldn't necessarily hit Moscow, but they could hit Moscow if they were fired from Ukrainian jets inside Russian territory. Now, the Ukrainians have the Su-25 Frogfoot. In fact, they used one of those to shoot down MH470, which was the Malaysian 777 that the Ukrainians brought down in conjunction with the Chinese, that the Ukrainians could easily have modified their Frogfoots to take Storm Shadow. Well, the Ukrainians know what they're doing. Zelensky would not be pressing unless he knew how he was going to use the missiles. Now, whether he's telling Starmer and Biden how he's going to use the missiles is another story. He may be saying that they're going to do a ground launch from Ukraine when all along the intent is to do an air launch from inside Russia.
Which they've done. There have been drones.
Well, yes. In which case they could hit Moscow.
Moscow, yeah.
Yep. So the real target may be President Putin and the Kremlin. I suspect, thinking about it, that the real target the Ukrainians are going after is the Russian leadership, and that means a missile attack on the Kremlin.
That would have to come from Germany then, or Finland.
No, the Ukrainians, if they're allowed to fire Storm Shadows, if they're allowed to deploy Storm Shadows against Russian targets, they could do an air-launched Storm Shadow, bearing in mind the missile is designed for air launch. It doesn't have to be modified for air launch. It has to be modified. You still have to attach the missile to the aircraft, and it's not designed to operate from Soviet-designed fighters. I don't know that you can launch it from an F-16. It might actually even be able to launch a Storm Shadow from an F-16.
Okay, assume that the Ukrainians actually launch.
Yes.
And they successfully hit their targets. What would Russia do in response? And are we at risk here in little old Blighty, a little island off?
Well, we can't exclude the possibility of a Russian strike against the UK. I don't think it's likely. I don't want to alarm people.
Or UK assets.
Yeah, it's far more likely that rather than declare war against Britain, America, or France, or a combination, it's far more likely that the Russians would escalate the war against the Ukraine, go all out, and launch a massive ground invasion, and that might be the end of any peace deal. And we might see Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine, forcibly incorporated into Russia.
Well, that's not in their interests, really, is it?
Well, I think the Ukrainians are gambling that if they can eliminate President Putin, who I think is the real target of the Storm Shadow, I think their thinking is if they can hit the Kremlin at a time when they know President Putin is going to be there, and if they can take out President Putin, then the Russians will crawl away and go home. But that just
okay, right? Climate change.
That assumes that President Putin is a dictator, but he isn't a dictator. He's not Joseph Stalin or Tony Blair. He is the elected leader of the Russian Federation, and there will be people to replace him with popular support. A bit like when Starmer goes, Angela Rayner, who met the king on Friday, I gather, Angela would be Deputy Prime Minister. Sorry, acting Prime Minister. She's the deputy at the moment. She'd be acting Prime Minister when Starmer
Russia
goes.
has always needed warm water ports. Is it not fundamental that with the way the weather's going and the northern ports freezing up, they must have access to warm water ports, and they will not let go on any terms Crimea?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Russia's always had. The Russians understand that the world is not warming up. They understand global warming is nonsense. So they still have a strategic need for warm water ports. I agree, and therefore the Crimea is very important to them.
So they're never going to let go on that.
No, and of course, if they end up taking over the whole of Ukraine, then they'd get Odessa as well, which is a very important port. There is a copy of my book, Spyhunter, second edition, 2014.
Oh, a second edition?
Well, the second edition came out in 2014. Ideally, I'd like to update it. There's so much happened since 2014. Some of it predicted in my book. I'd love to update it with the third edition, but my God, the time that's required is...
well, time is something we don't have.